we're recording this now, and and of course I've just lost everybody, but I knew it was here somewhere. Oh, there we go. And so what's going to happen is my father's going to speak. You are welcome to ask questions. I will kind of monitor people. Please, 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 if you have a question, try to do so by raising your hand. And I think it's the if you click on the reactions button and you click raise hand, that's the best way for me to see if you have a question, or maybe in the chat. I'll be doing my best to kind of monitor that as well. But you're welcome to ask questions as it's happening, and of course afterwards, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask that as well. Mary, you already have a question, or you're just testing out your raise hand button? He hasn't even said a word yet.
I'm just practicing.
Great. Okay. Now click the button that says lower hand, and we're good to go. So Dad, I think I'm going to turn it over to you from this point forward and let you share a little bit about Judaism on a magic carpet.
Thank you, Ari. It's a pleasure, and I'm grateful and honored that you've asked me. And hello, everybody. Some of us have met before. I have a reaction, and did you see my reaction?
Yeah, I saw thumbs up. That was great.
And for you, one more.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's a great honor and a pleasure. And I've visited your beautiful congregation before. I've known your rabbi longer than any of you. But his mother is sitting next to me right now, so she's known him even longer, and can attest that he has all the qualities that make him as wonderful as he is. He's a scholar, and he is a lover of Judaism, and he's a great personality. He attracts people, and there's a charisma about him that is quite extraordinary. And that I'm saying this, and he's hearing it. He knows it already, but I've said this to him a million times in a million different ways. And you are a lucky congregation, and a wonderful one too. And he's lucky to have you as his congregants. So thank you. And you can stop me anytime you want to. And Ari, I guess you're going to moderate this, right?
I will. I'll take care of it.
So feel free to chime in at any point. Chazi is originally born in Baghdad. Is that correct?
Yes.
And really, that's kind of where everything begins. We're talking about Judaism on a magic carpet. And I'm going to put on my magic carpet hat, because you need a genie to take you on a magic carpet. And I'll take it off after a while. But our story really begins in Baghdad. And because that's what was the center of Jewish life in the first 10 centuries of the Common Era, up until and including the 10th century, 1,000 years ago. Judaism was created in the academies of Babylonia, and Baghdad is adjacent to that, off of the hat. I'm still going to be the genie on this magic carpet. So the story really is it not only an interesting, fascinating, magnificent story of the most extraordinary Jewish community in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, I'm talking about from the defeat of the Romans in the year 410, when the Roman Empire came to a close, until the beginning of the Renaissance, and that's the 13th and 14th centuries. So for 1,000 years in Europe was the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages meant that there was a universal cosmic illiteracy and superstition, nothing of any value in terms of intellect or study. All of that was while Christian Europe was in the Dark Ages, Muslim Middle East and Mediterranean area, these areas were full of enlightenment. And so when people say, what happened, what was Judaism like in the Middle Ages? Was it like Christianity, which was a zero or even minus? No, Judaism was prospering in the Middle Ages in Babylonia, Baghdad, Sura, Pompadita, Nehardea, the great academies of Babylonia, and ultimately our subject for tonight, Spain. And that is where a magnificent community was established. One of Ari's teachers, and mine too, was Jacob Rader Marcus, the great historian, who said, never say that any Jew was the first Jew anyplace, because I'll find somebody who was there even earlier. and that probably is true with regard to Spain. Hispania was a Roman conquest. Everybody knows about Russell Crowe. What he was, Maximus. He was a Spaniard during the period of the Roman Empire. And during that period, there were Jews living in Spain, and there was always colonies of Jews in the Mediterranean area, in the basin. You can hardly think of any area where there wasn't some small Jewish settlement during the period of the Romans. And when the Roman Empire was destroyed in the 5th century, Visigoths, Christians who had destroyed the Roman Empire, conquered, came in, and were in Spain, and Jews were living there. But the Visigothic rule in Spain was incredibly cruel for the Jews. In fact, one of the worst periods of all. But things changed, reversed themselves instantaneously in the year 711, an easy number to remember for anybody who's ever shot dice, thrown craps. 7 and 11 are the lucky numbers that come up first. In the year 711, the Muslims, this is now in the 1st century after the death of Muhammad, they moved across northern Africa, and finally in spring of 711 crossed Gibraltar into Spain and defeated the Visigothic colonies, or the empire in Spain there. And instantaneously, in 1 year, if you can visualize, I don't have a map, but some of you can visualize the map of Spain from the Mediterranean to the Pyrenees Mountains, which is where France begins. The Muslims conquered all of Spain, with some small exceptions, in 1 year, and defeated the Christians. This is a very terrible defeat for the Christians, because they believed everything emanated from God. And if they were defeated, it meant that God permitted them to be defeated. And so it became a theological imperative for them to recover Spain from the Muslims. And that recovery was called the Ray Conquista. For those of you who know a little Spanish, the reconquest, Ray Conquista. And that began in the year 712. In the year after they were defeated, they began with small skirmishes in north and northeastern Spain to recover what they had lost. Meanwhile, there were Jews who were liberated now. No longer were the Visigoths ruling. Now the Muslims came in, and the Muslims were wonderful to the Jews. You have to be, to any images you have of Muslim hostility to Jews, it disappears when you think about the Middle Ages in Spain. The Muslims were hospitable to the Jews, and they used the Jews as their colonizers. The Jews understood what the Muslims had conquered and translated it for them. So the Jews were installed at that point in Spain as small as colonizers. They were tax collectors, they had businesses. They helped to create districts in Spain, and the Muslims relied upon the Jews to interpret for them what the Muslims had conquered. So now on our magic carpet, I'm going to take you to 3 places that were conquered by the Muslims in the year 711, remained under Muslim influence for centuries. And generally we say that period, the Muslim period in Spain, went from 711 to another easy number to remember, to 1212. That's the end of the dates that I'm going to give you. And the 1212 date is the date when the Christian Ray Conquista had reached a certain place in central Spain called Las Navas de Tolosa, for those of you who want to have the critical information, and the Ray Conquista, the reconquering of Spain, was pretty much settled. They were on their way for taking all of Spain. But in that period from 711 to 1212, 500 years, that was the Muslim period, which I call the golden age of Spanish Judaism, and I'll tell you why. Let's take on our magic carpet a trip. Get on. I'll take you. Trust me. And we will go to 3 places in Spain. Has anybody here visited Spain? Good. I don't know how I'm going to know that, but I saw.
You can't see people's faces. You'd have to look more carefully, but a number of people have visited Spain.
David and Cindy Fox. No, then you know that in Spain, the southern district of Spain is called Al-Andalusia, or the Arabs called it Al-Andalus. Andalusia is gorgeous, and when COVID is over, you have to put this immediately on your bucket list to visit if you haven't. It's exquisite, and there are 3 places that I want to point out on this magic carpet ride. The first is the city of Cordova. Cordova is known as the city of caliphs, and in Cordova, this is the center of Muslim life. Today, there are magnificent evidences of that particular civilization. One is the Mezquita. Sounds like mosque, and it really is. It's a great mosque of Cordova that was built in the middle of the 10th century, around 950, by the Caliph Abd ar-Rahman III, and who expanded the influence of Muslim Spain throughout the Mediterranean. He had a powerful navy, and that navy was one of economic prosperity for Spain and also of military conquest. So here we are in the city of Cordova, and Abd ar-Rahman III has one of his most important, his top advisor, a Jew whose name was Hasdai ibn Shaprut. Hasdai, for the Hebrew, from Chesed, loving kindness. Hasdai was a Mediterranean, a Sephardic, Spanish kind of name. Hasdai ibn is Ben in Arabic and in Hebrew of this period, Arabic. Hasdai ibn Shaprut. Hasdai, son of the son of Shaprut, but it was a family name. And Hasdai was a learned individual. He was skillful in any number of languages, not just Arabic, which was the lingua franca of the period, and certainly the language spoken in Spain, because the Muslims were in control, but he also knew Latin and Greek and the languages which Russians in Eastern Europe, and the Frankish languages, which were German and French. He was an amazing scholar, a man of great learning, and also, I've used the word before to describe your rabbi, charisma. And he was also a doctor. Lots of Jews in the Middle Ages were doctors, and Hasdai ibn Shaprut was the caliph. The caliph is not just the king. The caliph is a combination of empowerments, a combination of a pope and a shogun. He was the religious head, and he was the military and civil head of Andalusia. And all of Spain was under his control. And the city of Cordova, for those of you who may have visited in the past, and hopefully will visit in the future, was incredible then. This is all 1,000 years ago. This discussion tonight is going to be not exactly, but close to 1,000 years ago. Hasdai ibn Shaprut, 990. The next person I'm going to talk about is Samuel Hanagid, 1010. And we'll talk about Saragosa, the third city, and that'll also be on 1010. So all of it about the year 1000, when Europe was locked in darkness, that is intellectual darkness. And Spain was alive with ideas because they had brought it from the Middle East. There was in the Muslims, as you know, the kind of numerology that we use is Arabic numerals. The Christians were using Latin Roman numerals. I don't know how they did it. How do you do algebra, which comes from the Arabic? The Arabs invented algebra and sciences. They understood language arts, whereas in Christian Europe, as I said before, exactly the reverse. Nothing, zero. But wherever the Muslims were, in the Middle East, North Africa, and tonight for us in Spain, the lights were on. And literally the lights were on in Cordova. There were 10 miles of lighted streets in Cordova in the year 1000. In London, in the year 1000, there was not 1 inch of lighted streets. In Paris, nothing. In Rome, nothing. But in Cordova, 10 miles of lighted streets. I guess they did that with gas lamps, but imagine the difference in the quality of civilization between the Muslims and the Christians. The Muslims were on top of the world in the year 1000, and Jews along with them. Because Muslims, my feeling about it is this, that for Christians in the Middle Ages, not today, for Christians, Jews were centrally evil. You know, think about the New Testament and Jesus and the charges of deicide. But for Muslims, Jews were peripherally evil. Not that bad. They could live with them. And they did. Hasdai ibn Shaprut became advisor to the Caliph Abdurrahman III. He was the most powerful ruler in all of Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, there was the Byzantine Church and all of its apparatus. But in Western Europe, that is from Italy to the Atlantic Ocean, the Muslims were in control. Not in Northern Europe, of course. That was still Christian. That was still the Dark Ages. And in 1348, when the period of the Black Plague, which struck down Europe, and including including Spain, of course. I've always, by the way, this is as an aside, the Black Plague, thinking about COVID. You know, in 1 year, in 1348, 1/3 of the European population died. So what a terrible thing the Black Plague was. But would you believe there's an upside to the Black Plague? And I don't really know if I can compare this with COVID, but the upside was that before the plague, there really wasn't enough food to go around. And so people really had to work hard just to stay alive. But after the plague, the crops didn't die, the people died. And so there were much fewer mouths to feed. And with that came the opportunity for learning and for advancing civilization. So the Renaissance itself in Italy especially was an outgrowth of the Black Plague in terms of an upside to bad. And maybe there'll be an upside to COVID. COVID, of course, is not as horrible as the Black Plague was. Anyway, Jews any questions? Any agreement or disagreement? Feel free. So the Jews in Spain, in Cordova, who circulated around Abdurrahman III and his advisor and doctor, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, were incredibly privileged and wealthy because Hasdai ibn Shaprut, although he was never given an official title, unofficially was the chief of state. And as such, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Hasdai ibn Shaprut. It seems to me that he is an individual who should really be enshrined in the Jewish Hall of Fame for what he did. He was the Maecenas. He was coming out of the Greek legacy, who brought to Spain scholars, rabbis, teachers, especially from the Middle East and North Africa, and brought them to Cordova. So Cordova became a center of Jewish life, the center of Jewish life. And Chasdai succeeded beyond his wildest imaginings. He was not only the doctor to the Caliph, but he was the pediatrician to the son of the Caliph, Al-Hakam the second. And as a result, the close relationship that a patient has with his doctor or her doctor, especially if the doctor is your pediatrician. The next Caliph who followed Abdurrahman III was the patient of Chasdai ibn Shaprut, at least in his teenage years, and in that setting, Spain became a powerful place for Jews to live, and very comfortable. Think of European Jewish life as always tenuous. You never know where the axe is going to fall. But in Spain, in the year 1000, it was exactly the opposite of all the characterizations of negativity that you may be thinking of with regard to European life. Chasdai ibn Shaprut was also an extraordinarily interesting individual. He did a couple of things that you may not know, beyond being the doctor to the most powerful man in Western Europe and the Mediterranean, and the advisor, unofficial, no title, because the Muslims didn't think the Jews should have titles. Only they should have titles, but they were very good to the Jews. Nonetheless, the Jews didn't have official places in the government, only unofficial. And as a result, there were two things that happened you should know about. One is a story I always love, and that is in northern Spain, there was a prince whose name was Sancho, and the kingdom was Navarre. And by now that had been taken back in the Ray Conquista, and Navarre was a Christian kingdom. And Sancho was obese beyond your wildest imaginings. And as a result, he also should have been the king of Aragon, the connecting kingdom to Navarre. But he was so fat, he could not get on a horse. And the people ridiculed him because a king, he should ride on a horse, he should look like a king. And so his grandmother, whose name was an easy Hebrew word to remember, but it had nothing to do with Hebrew, her name was Queen Toda. Sounds like the Hebrew thank you. Grandmother had heard about this famous Jewish doctor in Cordova, and called for him to come and examine her grandson so that Sancho could go on a weight reduction regimen, get on a horse and ride back to Navarra and to Aragon and take them both. And as a result, Chasdai ibn Shaprut went to Navarra, looked at the fat prince, and actually, I tell my students, when he came in to see Sancho, Sancho said, "I'm so embarrassed, I'm so fat. I don't want to show you how I look." And Chasdai said, "I'm a doctor. You can tell me anything you want to. And you're going to laugh." And I said, "I don't laugh, I'm a doctor." He said, "All right, this is what I look like." And Chasdai said, "You are really fat." And he said, "But I can't treat you here. I will treat you only if you come to Cordova to my offices," or whatever he had there, and his assistants. And that exactly is what happened. Queen Toda, the Christian monarch in Navarre, and Sancho made their way through Spain, and it was a trip that today you can do in 3 or 4 hours on the Spanish equivalent of the interstate highway. But in those days, it took weeks. Traveled all the way from Navarra to Cordova, and had to bow down to Abdurrahman III, the Caliph, the Christian monarch bowed to the Muslim monarch. And that was very symbolic, of course. And it went to show the nature of his being able to conspire. And what happened as a result was that these northern kingdoms, Sancho got on a horse, got back, he took his rightful possession, his rightful place, and Hasdai was congratulated by the Caliph, and these Christian kingdoms became lackeys. They were under the control of Muslim Spain. But the most important thing that I always think of in terms of Hasdai ibn Shaprut is something called the Khazar correspondence. If I had a blackboard, it's Khazar. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It's one of the most extraordinary unknown moments in Jewish history. Hasdai had heard through messengers and merchants that there was actually a Jewish kingdom in the year 1000 in Europe or in Asia. And he was, so to say intrigued is to understate it. He was infatuated. It was beyond belief, because the Jews, we have been hoping for the Mashiach, for the Messiah to come into, if not Jerusalem, someplace that the Jews would rule themselves and not be under the thumb of a king or a prince of another religion. No, there was a Jewish kingdom, and the messenger said this kingdom existed in Asia between the Caspian and the Black Seas. If I had a map and a blackboard, I'd illustrate. And Hasdai was so intrigued by this, and that he investigated. And he sent letters around the year, everything around the year 1000, with messengers to Constantinople, which was where the Byzantine, the Eastern Orthodox Church was centered. But there were friendly relations between Abdurrahman III, the Caliph in Cordova, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantinos Porphyrogenitos. And so the messengers got through to Constantinople. And from there, if you can visualize in your mind's eye the map that would lead you to the Black Sea, to Crimea, the Odessa, which was later on to become a center of Jewish life itself, and then to the Caspian Sea. He found the messengers delivered the letter from Hasdai ibn Shaprut to the king of the Khazars. Now we know this is not a myth. I mean, you can go, also on this trip that we're going to take to Spain together with your rabbi, you can go to Cambridge University in England, and there in the rare book room, you will find manuscripts, not the original, of course, copies of this particular letter that Hasdai ibn Shaprut wrote to the king of the Khazars. And he said in the letter, this is in essence, how did you come to be? A Jewish kingdom? I would never imagine. How did it happen? And the king of the Khazars wrote back. This letter they say is not authentic because it wasn't actually written by the king of the Khazars, written by somebody else contemporaneous with Khazaria. Therefore, for me at least, it is authentic. And also in Cambridge University book room, because why is everything in Cambridge? You know? Because Solomon Schechter, who was a professor, later became the founder of conservative Judaism in America around the year 1900, was a professor at Cambridge University and took an expedition to the Middle East. And they went to Cairo to Fostat, which was the center of Cairo, and they found a Geniza, a book room that had been sealed up, and he and his expedition unsealed it, and they found manuscripts and letters that dated back to not the actual letter to the Middle Ages, but copies of copies. And he, being a professor at Cambridge, all of those documents now are at Cambridge University, in the rare book room. That's someplace I would like to see one of these days. And to see as not the original, but pretty, as Larry David says, pretty good. And so what was the message? The message was that here was a Jewish kingdom, and it really had existed from the 7th century, long before Chasdei ben Shaprut, and probably came to an end around the year 1050. So when he got there, it was on a decline, and defeated by Peter of Kiev, Russia, and absorbed. The writer Arthur Kessler wrote his most famous book is called Darkness at Noon. He wrote another book called The 13th Tribe, which he imagines what happened to these Khazars, these Jewish Khazars from the steppes of Central Asia, who had an amazing kingdom. And what they did for a living, they were mercenaries, Jewish mercenaries, described as ferocious, red-headed people. I can tell you that earlier in his life, your Rabbi Ari was a ferocious, red-headed guy. Today he hasn't got much red hair left, but he was, and they were mercenaries working for the Muslims, the Arabs in Baghdad, Hezi, to guard the estuaries of the Volga and the Don rivers against the Vikings who were coming in from the Baltic, and you could actually sail ships on those rivers. You have to carry them a little bit too, and ultimately reach from the Caspian, reach Middle East and raid Baghdad. Can you imagine the Vikings raiding Baghdad? You have to go to my class and I'll give you a little more detail about how that was done. At any rate, Chasdei ben Shaprut was the instigator of the correspondence with the king of the Khazars, and he found out that this Jewish kingdom did in fact exist, and and how did they learn about Judaism? That's part of his initial letter was, how did you become Jews? How did you learn about it? And how do you practice Judaism? This is now 6th and 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, and 10th and 11th centuries too. And who do you think their teachers were? The rabbis from the academies in Babylonia, who came to Khazaria and taught them. Question that you have to think of, I mean, maybe you're thinking about it right now. Who is authentically Jewish? These people are all converts to Judaism, because the king converted to Judaism. Arthur Kessler says in his book, the reason was because the Byzantine Empire was on one side, Christianity, and the Muslim Caliphate was on the other side, Baghdad, and they wanted to become independent. They believed they would be conquered and absorbed. How could they be independent? In the 7th century, only by becoming monotheists themselves. They were shamanists. They were worshiping totem poles. So how do they become monotheistic? And the king, according to Kessler, became a monotheist because that way he would remain independent. There are versions of how the decision was made that the monotheistic religion they would settle on would be Judaism and not Christianity or Islam. That's for another day. This is much more interesting and complicated, but this is enough for right now. Chasdei ben Shaprut was the instigator of the Khazar correspondence that we have to this day, which is the most authentic and significant linkage we have with Khazaria and the Khazar Jews. And I have always believed, and I'm sure Ari has too, that you don't have to be Middle Eastern to be Jewish. Abraham was Middle Eastern, Moses was an Egyptian, and Kessler suggests that when the Khazar Empire came to its close in the 11th century, those Jews migrated to Northern Europe and settled mostly in Poland and in Russia. And that may or may not be. They may have been absorbed into the general population, but Kessler makes the case in this book, The 13th Tribe, that the tremendous community in Poland, which was the dominant European Jewish community for centuries, in the 14th and 15th centuries, its beginning, that the Polish Jews really were the children and grandchildren of the Khazar Jews. Chazdai ibn Shaprut. Magic carpet has to keep going because I don't want any questions about Cordoba. So Chazdai was the great Jew of Cordoba, and he brought Jewish scholarship and learning and sophistication to Spain. He was I use the word often Maecenas, that the Greek king who everything he touched was good. So let's move on a little bit further and to another place. If you like Chazdai, I got somebody even better. To Granada. And Granada is located in the mountains, also in Andalusia in southern Spain. And Granada, it was called by the Jews here, Harimonim, the city of pomegranates. It smells like flowers and pomegranates too. And in Granada, there arose, now coming to the beginning of the 11th century, around the beginning of the 1000s, the empire, the caliphate of Abdurrahman III and his son Al-Hakam II began to disintegrate, and instead, Andalusia was taken over by Berbers, African tribesmen who had been imported by the Arabs to be their mercenaries in Spain. The mercenaries defeated their masters and took over. And here we come to Granada, which was a city and a state, a city-state, operated by the descendants of mercenaries who had been imported by their Arab masters. And you're thinking that must have been terrible for the Jews. Just the opposite. It was wonderful for the Jews. Because if you picked up what I said to you about why Chazdai ibn Shaprut didn't have an official title, because he was a Jew. And he could only do whatever he did sub rosa, under the covers, he did that wonderfully. Now we come to Granada, no more Umayyad Muslims. Umayyads were the dynasty that came over and established themselves in Spain. Now, Berber kingdoms, Berbers who were themselves mostly illiterate, but who respected the Jews. But not only that, but now life changed in Spain from an aristocracy to a meritocracy. Not who you were in terms of your name and your lineage, but who you were in terms of what you could do for me now. And that was the system basically in Granada, under the Berbers, in which case an individual, and under that, an individual arose, also a scholar, a rabbi, a poet, a military leader, a general, whose name was Samuel HaNagid. He, at least in my heart, is the most significant personality in the Middle Ages, not just in Spain, but any place. Spinoza is at the end, is the early modern period. He is the Spinoza of the Middle Ages, Samuel HaNagid, Samuel the Prince. Let me tell you about his background. The only thing he wasn't was he was not a doctor. He was a rabbi. He was a poet. He was a political leader. He was the Grand Vizier. The Grand Vizier means the Secretary of State, but it really means more than that. There was a king, but the king was king only nominally, in name. Samuel HaNagid controlled it was called a taifa. A taifa was a city-state, the city-state of Granada, which incorporated most of Andalusia and southern Spain. He was the leader. He also, as I said to you, was the military, the general. and I often, here's one for you, and maybe you'll give me some feedback on this one. I contend that with one or two possible exceptions, he was the only Jew in history ever to be military commander of a non-Jewish army. So no Moshe Dayan's, no, that was Jewish. Right? Can you think of any other Jew who was ever commander-in-chief of a non-Jewish army? Any hands? I'm looking. Let me see. Well, okay. I'm gonna give you some information on this one. The one is General Sir John Monash, who Bernard Lewis, actually, the great historian, told me when I said, no, there's only one other person, and that was Leon Trotsky. He was the founder of the Red Army and commander-in-chief over a century ago of the Red Army, who was assassinated, as you know, by Stalin. But General Sir John Monash was commander of the Army of Australia in World War I for a short period of time. And there was a Monash University in Australia, so he was a significant person. But Samuel Hanagid, I don't put Monash or Leon Trotsky. I once said this to in Moscow, that Samuel Hanagid wrote poetry, beautiful war poetry. And in one of his poems, he talks about people who wore tzitzis, you know what, tzitzit, fringes, like a talit, under their armor. He wore a talit under his armor. Because how do I know? Because he writes poetry about it, and he talks about himself. And he talks about those who do not wear fringes under their garments. Can you imagine a Jewish knight in shining armor? That's what he was in the 11th century, around the year 1000. So I once said in a class in Moscow, no, he was a Jewish knight in shining armor. Never another Jew commander-in-chief of a non-Jewish army. And I think it was Boris Klotz who got it. I know one other, Trotsky, but he did not wear tzitzis under his armor. He didn't. Trotsky was an atheist. Samuel Hanagid was a practicing Jew and a believer. His poetry, I would say this, that on the highest level of Hebrew poetry in the Middle Ages, you have to put probably only one person, Judah Halevi. But you mentioned a few others too, names of streets in Tel Aviv and poets. But on the second level, very close to Judah Halevi, I put Samuel Hanagid. He wrote poetry from the battlefield. And the way in which he did that was however a day went in the year 1010, at a certain point, he goes to his battle tent in the evening, and he washes and he davens, he prays. And how do I know? Because he writes this in his poetry. This is what my day was like. And he meets with his brigadiers to plan the strategy for the next day or the next week. And then he writes a poem. And his poems are existential, about himself, his life, what he believes in, and the passage of time, his aging. He writes about Jewish life in his world. These are incredible poems, and you can get them. And Rabbi Ari can tell you how to get them. Penguin Book of Jewish Poetry, and you'll see
Carmi's book, the Carmi poetry book, which I have.
Right, T. Carmi book, and I have 2 copies of it, and I think you stole one of them, Ari, but that's okay. The Carmi book, you'll see poem after poem after poem by Samuel Hanagid. How did he get these poems? And this is an incredible story. He would write these poems since I was there with him, I visualized it. So there's a term for about the psyche being able to transport you. And you're on magic carpet with me now, so I want you to try to visualize it too. He would find a time after he met with his brigadiers and he planned the strategy, and after he washed and prayed, that he would write a poem. And how did he deliver it for publication? He carried with him in his wagon, the wagon of the commander-in-chief, pigeons, homing pigeons, and he would place the poem, wrap it up, and put it in a capsule, and the pigeon would fly back to Granada, because he may have been 50 miles away, which is like a lifetime away, or even 100 miles away at a battlefield, and the pigeon would fly back to his rooftop, where his son, not a great guy, but that's for another chapter. If you ever invite me back, his son would recover the bird and take the poem and preserve it for collection. But that's how we have so much of his poetry. He wrote it while he was at war. And this man, say guy is to minimize him, this man was the most, I can never say that, that's a little bit much. He was extraordinary. And I admire him more than any other medieval Jew. But he lived in a world where he was able to succeed. That was the world of Berbers, who were the mercenaries, illiterates from North Africa, but who appreciated what you could do for them. And that was the meritocracy of Spain at the time.
What language he used to write his poetry?
Hebrew. Whereas you're absolutely correct to ask the question. The language of the world, the lingua franca, was Arabic. As you're probably wondering, what language did he write the Khazar correspondence? Did Chazdai ibn Shaprut communicate with the king of the Khazars? Arabic. How do I know this? Because I spoke to my teacher, Martin Cohn, about a year or two ago. I said, did he write in Hebrew? No. He wrote in Arabic. That was the lingua franca. But the language of poetry was Hebrew. And it's magnificent poetry. I think at the highest level, with the exception of Judah Halevi, who is uniquely extraordinary. So here we have this significant individual in Granada around the year 1000. Everything is around that time. The golden age really extends, I would say, from the year 711, when the Muslims conquered, till the year 1212. It's 500 years. That's not bad. If American Jewish life succeeds for 500 years, we're only in our 2nd century right now, 300 more years to go, pretty good. So that was, and it wasn't without problems, of course. There were blips, but Jewish life was magnificent. Of course, when the Christian Ray Conquista, when the Christians recovered Spain, everything changed. I told you, in my opinion, the reason is because Judaism was only peripherally evil for the Muslims, but absolutely centrally evil with regard to Christians. And there were a series of disputations for another time, where the Christians pronounced the Jews to be demonic and removed from them any privileges they might have enjoyed until that point. So let's get back on the magic carpet, and I'll end up with one more city, which is not a normal touristico city. It's not even in southern Spain. It's not in Andalusia. It's more in northeastern Spain, and that is Saragosa. Has anybody been there? Probably not, because it's not really on the tourist route. It's not a great place to go for a tourist today. But in the year 1000, it was incredible. That's because Saragossa was on the Spanish March, which meant that is an area between where the Christians had almost conquered and where the Arabs had almost been defeated. They were living together for a century or two in total harmony. And the Jews too. As a result, this period of harmony, which is exemplified in Saragossa, and also a city you probably know about, Toledo, in central Spain. But Saragossa, most importantly, was a place of great Jewish learning. And because the Jews borrowed from the Muslims and learned from them, and that's how Maimonides, we were not going to get that far because Maimonides is not until the 13th century, and we're still in the 11th century, but Maimonides borrowed from Aristotle and also from Averroes, a Muslim philosopher, and this kind of cross-fertilization of religions and cultures was an extraordinary part of the life of Saragossa. And one last thing about it, because I know your Rabbi Ari loves Dikduk, Hebrew grammar. Hebrew grammar was invented in Saragossa in the 11th century. Now, you're saying, is that possible? Whoever wrote the Psalms in the Bible, did that poet know Hebrew grammar? Well, my opinion is no, it was intuitive. But in Saragossa in the 11th century, they began to develop systems of grammar. Some of you may know the Hebrew word binyanim, the conjugations of Hebrew. All of it became formalized in language arts that was created in Saragossa in the 11th century. So when you go on your bucket list trip to Spain, to Andalusia, definitely go to Cordova. You can't miss Cordova. And you'll go to, because the airport is in Madrid, and you'll go to Toledo, which is only 50 miles away, and then take you've been on it too. They have a interstate, kind of an autopista from Madrid to Cordova, and from there, country roads to Granada in the mountains, gorgeous. The Sierra Nevada mountains around Granada make it extraordinary, magnificently beautiful. I told you it's called Ir Harimonim, the city of pomegranates. It even sounds like Granada because it smells like flowers. And we're lucky enough to be there a number of times, and I would love to go back. Saragossa is not a place I'd like to go visit again, because there's nothing there that really caught my imagination, except my historic imagination, and that is to know a little bit about what it was 1,000 years ago. So that's our magic carpet, and I think I've exhausted you. And any questions or thoughts or observations? Are you going to fire your rabbi because of me? No.
I hope not. I hope not. And yeah, I see Richard Falk. Feel free.
Hi. I'd like to ask a question about the military. Is there any record of Jews serving as soldiers other than you mentioned the commander-in-chief being Jewish? But what about the average, or not even the average soldier? Were Jews in the Arab army or the Spanish army?
I doubt you mean the Muslim armies of
Muslim army.
Spain and during the period of the Umayyad Caliphate in Cordova.
Right.
I am not aware. I have no information about that. And during the period of the Taifas, especially in Granada, the Berbers, I would not be surprised if Jews were recruited in the Muslim armies of the Berbers. But we talked about something else where absolutely Jews were foot soldiers in the army of the Khazar Empire. I mean, this is part of the correspondence of Chasdai ibn Shaprut with the king of the Khazars. What do we do for a living? And what we do is we guard the estuaries of the Don and the Volga rivers, so the Vikings don't strike Baghdad. Can you imagine? So guard, we have soldiers down there. But the question, we're talking about Spain and not about Khazaria, but I'm not aware.
The other question I have is about the Khazars. I know there's been some studies on DNA, current studies on DNA, looking for a relationship between current Jews and Israelis and people who live in that area, and it's been unproductive. Do you have any comments about that?
Only that racism and Judaism are antithetical, because King Solomon had wives who were Ethiopians, who were black, and describes himself in poetry as black. And I lived in Japan, Japanese, and being Jewish is not a matter of race, it's a matter of who you believe you are on this caravan. So I don't know about that. I'm
right, not. I mean, I think that what Richard was asking also is there any type of connection between, have they done any DNA studies which would show a connection between people living in Israel and those who may have come from Khazaria, or is that, and that may be, knowing my father like I do, my guess is that you're not really familiar with any DNA evidence that's kind of come up in that regard, but I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I don't want to tell you what you know and don't know, but I'm just that may be a little bit outside of your.
That was wonderful, but I was not Israel, Khazaria and Brooklyn, wherever Jews live. What is their DNA? And wouldn't that be exciting?
Right.
I'm sure there have been biologists and physiologists who made those studies, but you can do that and find out what your origins are, can't you?
Yeah, if they migrated to Poland and Germany and Ukraine, then they, as you point out, they may very well be in Brooklyn also. Not necessarily, nothing specifically unique about Israel in this regard. So yeah,
they could be on Hampson Street in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Right.
Harry.
Well, I wonder if we have any type of DNA connection to the Khazars, but maybe, you never know. Bob Berkovitz, you have a thought or a question?
Yeah, a couple things. Great. Timeline, chronological. You said 7/11 to 12/12. The key persons and the events, is that available? I guess you have to take your course. And also
Right.
where the 13th Child book is available, is that still around? And the other thing I noted, in about 1921-22, the British Museum in New Penn had a partnership, and that's where T. Lawrence and Sir Leonard Woolley discovered the Tower of Babel and the other buildings. They started brick making around 4000 BCE.
Yeah, great. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Lynn, do you have a thought or a question?
Yeah, no. Where can you get a timeline and a chronology and the key persons and events you were talking about, other than your course?
Well, I would suggest, in terms of books, there is a volume by Eliyahu Ashtor, Ashtor. It's a history of the Jews of Muslim Spain in 3 volumes. It reads like a novel, and you would love it, and not like any ordinary history. There also is a work about Jews and Christian Spain, again, mostly century on to the expulsion. And by the way, what we haven't mentioned is these glorious communities in Andalusia. Of course, it all came to a crashing end in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yeah.
Ferdinand and Isabella kicked out the Jew. And the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. On July 30th, the last Jew, except that some are coming back right now because because Spain is interested in tourism, but for centuries, no Jews lived in Spain. And yeah.
Thank you. Let's go to Lynn. Lynn, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Having been to Granada several times, the romance, there's something about the Alhambra that makes you think, how did that happen? Where did that figure into this story that is telling? Because you think of that as almost the beginning of the Inquisition. So you almost. So were there Jews in Granada? Were there Jews? That's what I'm trying to get that timeline straight.
Samuel Han-Nagid, the person I told you about, the poet and warrior and statesman and everything but a doctor.
Yeah.
His son Joseph Ibn Nagrela, Joseph Han-Nagid, followed him. And there's a legend that he, I don't know if it can be verified, but that Joseph Ibn Nagrela, the son of Samuel Han-Nagid, was the instigator of some of the early drawings of the Alhambra around the year 1015. And of course, the Alhambra was developed mostly in the 13th century. And
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
you should. It's a bucket list thing to do, and it was significant in terms of the Ray Conquista. The Christians came in, and of course took over Granada and the Alhambra and made it their own. And so the Alhambra became a significant part of the Ray Conquista.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, would you like to? You're open. It's your mic.
First of all, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I have a little problem with the translation of the names to English. So I just want to ask you, when you say Khazaria Kingdom, you mean Mamlechet HaKuzarim?
Yes.
So after Ibn Shaprut, Yehuda Halevi wrote the famous Kuzari.
Well, Yehuda Halevi wrote the Kuzari.
Oh, thank you. I was thinking, what is Khazar?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'll tell you this, that in the correspondence that I talked to you, authentic correspondence of the 11th century, Chazdai ibn Shaprut and the messengers back and forth to the king of the Khazars, question was asked, how did you become Jewish? And the king of the Khazars said, in his response, we became Jewish because we needed a monotheistic religion. I told you that. So the question was, should it be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam? So they had representatives of all three. And the king of the Khazars said, well, make sense to me of why I should choose your religion over the other two. And so the Christian began by talking about the belief systems having to do with Jesus of Nazareth. And the king of the Khazars said, actually, this is part of Yehuda Halevi, Judah Kuzari, in which he recreates that situation in a philosophical work, and Judah Halevi is several centuries later. Judah Halevi is in the 13th century, but he remembers the story of the king of the Khazars and the Jews who came to connect. And he said the way in which they decided to become Jews because they had a challenge. Which of the three monotheistic religions made the most sense in a rational way? And so the Christians said, because you believe in Jesus, it doesn't make, that's not rational. And because Jesus was crucified and gave back to life, this doesn't make any sense to me. And then the Muslims said, oh, because Islam is the most rational of all religions, because Muhammad is magnificent, and because the Quran is written in Arabic, which is exquisite. And the king says to the Muslim representative, I don't understand Arabic. And the Jew says, and this is a very interesting response, he says, explain to me in a rational way why Judaism is better than the other two. And the Jew says, well, everybody has always hated us.
Yeah.
And we still are here. We survive. The king says, yeah, I hate you too, but you're right. It makes sense rationally. That's how Judah Halevi described the showdown of the three monotheistic religions, and why and then the rest of the Kuzari, which comes from the word Khazar, the king of the Khazars, is defense of Judaism and explanation of Judaism, the principles of Judaism.
Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that.
Thank you.
I see Andrew. I'm not exactly sure which Andrew this is, but please.
Hi, Ari. Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, I know who this Andrew is now.
Sorry, I can't figure out how to get the camera. I just wanted to say I think it was really cute that your dad and my dad were talking tonight.
That is cute. That's right.
Thank you very much.
There's the link. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, listen, this has been great. And Dad, Abba, wonderful. Did a great job. I feel like I can bring this magic carpet to a nice soft landing back in my put the hat back on. Very good. And this has been, but I really appreciate it. And you can understand, by the way, I mean, my father was lecturing me all through my life on this stuff. No, he wasn't. He was more generous and more kind and more, but I can remember him talking about these people with the same type of enthusiasm back as I was growing up as he does to this very day. And just so thank you all for being a part of this. And Dad, thank you so much for coming through once again and being just a great opportunity for us to learn here at the temple. And I'm just so grateful.
Best rabbi in the world, you.
You are. Oh, fine. Thank you. And I have gotten enough props this evening that I think I can, I think it'll last me for quite a while. So thank you, everyone. And
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I think the next one in 2 weeks, I think Rabbi Neil Gold will be sharing Judaism and social justice. That should be really excellent. Also, I hope that Rabbi Neil Gold is as interesting and as thorough as Rabbi Goldstein was tonight. So thank you. All right, so everyone, take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ari.
Thanks, David.
Hey. Thank you, man.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, David.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you to Rabbis Goldstein. And Dad, when we end this, I will I'll end it, and then I will I will log in. I'll re-log into the